constitution, that becomes very risky.
Yeah.
But you have to operate within that. And unfortunately, the way that, because of how colonial our systems have been, including education systems, there's a lot of us who will default on the side of favoring the authority, especially if you are an older generation.
So that's the only reality you know.
And also you tend to think that anyone who challenges that is, a disobedient and disorderly child. The way we used to be kind of beaten in school. Someone was asking me a similar question, and I said, what happened to you when you were in primary school? And it would be, you do something wrong and your teachers are on your case. We've seen kids dying in this country because of that. And then you go back home and you tell your mother or your father that you were beaten by the teacher at school. Wanakuongezea.
Somehow you
must have done.
Let me tell you,
something wrong to deserve
let me tell you something crazy. There's a time I used to live in Kisumu.
Yes.
And there was a massive protest because there was a rise in insecurity. So the first governor of Kisumu. So guys were pissed, man. We've gone and we stood at the it's called what, Prosperity House.
Yes.
That's where his office is. So we were at the gates and the cops were there with the rungus and dogs. And guys are like, Ati, no peace, gee what, like just venting. And then the governor came out because guys were like, he has to address us. So I was just talking about that thing how you said that our children.
Yes.
You guys started referring to us as his children, man. I'm like, wait, bro, we're residents. We're not your kids.
And we are angry residents at that.
So that notion of calling us toys, I don't know, it's a mind trip. It's like you're making us feel like you're the only one with the solutions. You need to give us direction as our elder. So silly.
Yeah, and it also defines that you are supposed to behave in the way that I tell you to behave.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You don't ask questions, you don't challenge, you don't, So we don't realize how much of our structures and systems are shaped in a very colonial mentality.
That's true.
And that then, we see in all the systems.
Yeah.
So people can talk to us how they want and they're like, utadu. Right? What is the farthest that you can go? We are the ones with the power. With
the status
resources.
quo.
Yes, exactly.
Let me ask you something. I remember pre-2022, just before the elections, there was a hopeful fever around, the presidential candidate, former DP, current President William Ruto. Guys really related with him. Some of us, he's young.
Yes.
He's not the dynasty. He's coming from an outside-in point of view.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
And then he came with the hustler narrative.
He came with the hustler narrative that resonated, man. Every young guy in this country saw President William Ruto as the guy who's going to liberate us, get us from the shackles, the chains of the quote-unquote dynasty. Fast forward, our president got into power. And then we started seeing all these crazy things like... the debt question, of course, paying for some amounts that we don't even know exactly what we're paying for, how much it is exactly. Started seeing
who we are paying.
We started seeing corruption, unemployment getting out of hand, and of course, an out-of-control dollar and the increasingly tax predatory patterns of, the behavior exhibited our government, William Ruto's government. Now, fast forward, the outcomes of the expectations of the hustler government are extremely different from what we're seeing, the manifestations of this government. Are you surprised that we are here? And now again, the hustlers are like, "Hey, you guys, kwani nini ilikuwa happen?"
Tulichezwa.
Were you surprised that, things have changed so fast, 0 to 100?
No, I'm not at all.
Why
aren't you? This is one of the things that that was very easy to predict. So there's a quote I had. There's a quote I had recently, which I loved, and the statement goes: "You do not rise to the level of your aspirations; you fall to the level of your systems."
Oh no!
Right?
No, that sucks.
So you can have the greatest aspirations and you can have the best rhetoric, but ultimately the kind of systems and structures you have right are going to determine the kind of outcomes that you will get out of whatever you're doing. So look at the political system. So President Ruto has been in government since when he was a young man.
Most experienced politician, I guess.
In fact, he has never worked anywhere else, right? So if you think about that, he's a product of the system. If you look at all the people, the majority of the people who were in the system, in that UDA circle, in the Kenya Kwanza regime, they have been part of the system. So to imagine that there would be great innovative approaches or a change to the culture and attitudes is to be very ambitious, right? Now, having said that, there is something to be said for the man, because it's not easy, as you say, to come from being, holding this kind of outsider status, and also the fact that almost everyone understood that the circumstances of his deputy presidency were quite difficult, especially as we were leading to the election. And he got a good team of advisors, but as I've said, aspirations great, but what's the system? To be fair to President Ruto, I mean, the economy was already not great by the time he was taking over. In fact, I think his cardinal sin in that sense was promising too much, knowing very well that it was, unlikely that they would deliver. But then you go into government and it is so much easier to blame other people for the problems. And then you realize the buck stops here. But you are then beholden to particular interests. So politicians are the same. You're appointing these people to cabinet. You have debts to pay. So even the principal secretaries are going to be people that you owe some favors to. To expect transformative approaches to emerge from that group of people, again, is to be quite ambitious. So I'm not surprised in terms of where we have gone. I think what surprises me, though, is I understand that the job of a president, there are very few people who get to hold that position. So we can all think and imagine about what it means to be a president and what it takes to be a good one. But we only know this after the fact. Right? But when you hold that job, the learning curve is very steep. What has surprised me is how long it seems to have taken President Ruto to get with the program. Like, okay, you can kind of miss your step for the first 1.5 years, but if you're going into almost the third year and still things are looking dicey, then that means that either you have underestimated the role, or that you have failed to grasp because the president is just one person. But the system is not working.
But it's interesting you put it like that, because he was a DP for 10 years. So how is it that the learning curve is way steep and he was already in the presidency? So we would expect him to bring about changes fast, because he's been deep in it. There. He understands the problems. Clearly, he had radical different solutions. That's why we put him over there. So why again are you telling us that the learning curve was steep?
It's steep. So okay, there are different things.
Should we give him more time?
That is not what I'm saying. That is not what I'm saying. So, on the one hand, understanding problems is the easy part, right? Understanding the problems, even you and I here, we know by and large what the problems we have as a country are. Knowing the potential good solutions, right, is slightly harder, but that is again something that people will understand on how to solve. I think the mechanisms of how to get from here to there is where the complexity begins. Because it's not just you.
Correct.
There are so many stakeholders that are involved. And I think the other thing we forget is that, deputy presidents can be excluded. We've seen this very much in history, but also don't forget that we have a deputy president who serves as a deputy head of government, but does not serve as a deputy head of state.
Correct.
We do not have a deputy commander-in-chief of defense forces or whatever, right? So the job is it's not just one step up. It's a huge gap. So I think for me, I think that the president should have in time understood that things were going wrong at a very rapid pace, and then put corrective measures. I think for him to have to depend on the support of ODM, the opposition to kind of buttress his government, is not a good sign. It's not a good
we'll
sign.
get into that in a bit. 10.
Yeah.
Yes, I just tend to think 2 years now down the line in his presidency, William Ruto, do you think there's anything he'd do to win Kenyans back? Because clearly Kenyans right now are not happy, are not a happy lot with the president. And then number two, do you think Kenyans are angry enough? Because we've seen the quest and yearn for change, and we've actually even seen it lead to revolutions and the so-called Gen Z mandamano. Are Kenyans angry enough?
Well, let me start with the second one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Kenyans are angry. I listened to some of those X-spaces, especially, in the beginning, right in the heart of the Gen Z protests, and Kenyans are angry.
Yeah.
Because, you're struggling to put food on the table. You're not sure what's going to happen with your children, and you know that it's not because of your own failing.
Imagine.
You do all that it takes. You have actually followed the script.
Yeah.
You are told this is what it takes for you to succeed. You've gone to school. You've been obedient. You are not even on the noisemakers list, and still the outcomes are not what you would hope for. So Kenyans are angry. I think the other thing is Kenyans also get tired.
Yes.
Because you are out on the streets, you're shouting, you're calling for change, and you're not even saying, you want anything out of this world. It's just you guys were hired to do a job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just do your job. Why do I have to keep on reminding you over and over and over? So Kenyans get tired, and it's very unfortunate.
Yes.
And I think what we have seen, hopefully things change, is you are then faced by a regime or by a government that will not listen to what you are saying, which then means the only time you will be listened to is when you try to even raise your volume a bit higher, right? And sometimes they try to down you. Like you can see what's happening with Morara.
Yes.
I was very shocked. In Nyeri, there was no fire truck to go and rescue the kids.
Yeah.
But
But there's a fire truck to disrupt Morara's meeting, right? You can imagine that. Now, how do you engage with that kind of, disrespect,
So
right?
shocking.
From people that you yourself have put in office.
Yeah.
In terms of what President Ruto can do to win the hearts of Kenyans back, I don't know. I think at this point, I think he allowed things to go way too far.
Yeah.
And we are nearly halfway through the term. So looking, around this time, a few months midway through next year is when things start ramping up for the next election.
Yeah.
So it would almost be you are on a constant campaign mode.
Yes.
And if you are on the campaign mode, if you're on the top of vehicles all the time, then you're not really doing the work that you are hired to do. Which means when I look at the things that we would have hoped to be very successful, one of which for me was agricultural transformation, I don't think there's enough time to do much to win the success. Now, but as I said, we have to think about the politics as well.
Correct. I believe that. But I want to talk about public interest again in the sense of public participation.
Yeah.
Now, I remember since the Constitution promulgated in 2010, our democratic institutions, policies, regulations, and processes are supposed to be held constitutionally. You're supposed to be basically, there's supposed to be a sense of public interest. The public was included in some of these conversations, even when you're forming up laws and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
My general question is, why are politicians so afraid of public participation? Why don't they have the public's interest at heart? Then they just want to sort out their own special interests. How did this disconnect happen?
So the one thing is you have to remember that our politicians are used to manipulating systems. So if you think about elections, our elections get rigged quite a lot, or other kind of mechanisms are used to determine the outcomes of elections. So they're very used to predetermined processes. People want a predetermined outcome going into a process.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, they see the holding power as the ability, it's a gift you've been given to be able to predetermine the outcomes of things, including who's going to get what tender, who's going to get what job, something like this. Now, the problem with public participation from the perspective of politicians is that you cannot tell what's going to come out of it.
Right, it's unpredictable.
It is unpredictable, right? So if you want to do a deal, and I come and promise DJ 10 over here that, look, tupange hii kitu.
Yes.
At the end, we unapata hii, mi napata hii, we will do like, like this, like that. It's very important for me to make sure that this thing is delivered so that he gets his bit and I get mine.
Right.
If we bring you on board, right, you might disrupt or even start asking questions and proposing different things, which then makes the outcome unpredictable. So this makes politicians very uncomfortable. So you've seen how they have done public participation for a while. It's they come with a predetermined agenda. They select the people who go into the room, right, who will endorse the kind of things they are proposing. Is it any wonder that we saw now with the finance bill that you have come up with this thing which is so unpopular that there's really no one other than people in the regime who are supporting it, right? And of course the international organizations that were backing it. So I guess they missed the point of this system is built by all of us, that if you don't involve us, then we will also react, we will respond to these things. So I don't know. And of course what we've seen in the last 14 years of the constitution, they have seen they can disregard certain things. They can come up with maneuvers around the constitution.
And like they say in government, mtafanya nini kwani? It just gets me thinking about if there are Kenyans of goodwill out there, even within these spaces of government. Because when you look at even the colonial administration back in the day, it was technically designed not to benefit the people of Kenya, but to serve foreign interests. Moving forward, now we're seeing even previous governments of the recent past, Kibaki's, Uhuru's, now Ruto's government, where it's certain individuals who only get certain perks, certain benefits of government. People at the upper echelon, for example. Now, my question is very simple. Is it possible to distinguish yourself and rise through the Kenyan political ranks among the civil service honestly, without being morally ambiguous and motivated by the pursuit of personal gain? Is it possible, bro? You get in there, make change, fanyia watu kazi, ama you're just gonna get sucked into this system? Because we've seen a lot of people who say, okay, you guy, I'm a different guy. I got my radical points of view and ideologies. I'm going to work for the people. And then you know what happens. So I think in every regime so far, there have been those people who have been driven by public interest. One good example that comes to mind is Senator Okiya Omtata, for instance. Correct.
Right?
Correct.
He has remained very steadfast.
100%.
We've also seen other examples of people who, for instance, people may have different views of Justice Njoki Ndung'u, for instance, now that, in the Supreme Court. But when she was nominated to Parliament, she was a very progressive member of Parliament. She brought some very impactful legislation on the floor that changed some of the ways that we deal with, for instance, issues of sexual and gender-based violence in the country. So there are some who managed to actually, continue pursuing the public interest. I don't think it's always without some personal interest. I don't know whether we can say that, but there are some who overall we can say that they have contributed to the betterment of the society. It's a small number.
Just a follow-up question to that. We've been in spaces where, as Kenyans, first of all, as a society, we know that these things happen, and we talk mostly about it about how it's personal interest before public interest. Moving forward, we've seen some things that hint towards changes even in the political scene. Are we looking at change coming anytime soon in terms of now having a political class that will fully have public interests as their interest?
Or even public service.
Or public service. So I will tie that to the other part of your question that I hadn't got to, which is we have to think about, and you pointed to the interview I did with Tomboy a while back. We have to think about what it takes to become a politician.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So, for one thing, it costs a lot of money to run a campaign.
Yes.
Right? So, for a lot of people, this is seen as an investment.
Yeah.
That, you're going to then recover some of this money once you're
I agree.
once you're in office. So of course self-interest is always going to be there. I think the question of whether we can move towards people who are more selfless and more directed towards public service requires us to figure out how do we finance these people.
Yes.
So that they know that it's not your money that put you in there. We contributed because we have faith in you.
Yeah.
In order for you to deliver for us. Now, what we've seen with these protests, we've seen the kind of resource mobilization that we haven't seen before, like on Hanifa's medical bills fund.
31 million.
Yeah, 31 million. And also we have learned how much 31 million shillings actually is, because we are so used to being bamboozled with these big figures, right?
Correct.
You've seen people now mobilizing resources for Morara, for instance. So if we keep up with that, then it means that this person is accountable to you because they are holding that position, but also because you partly paid for that person to get into that office, right? But then obviously we must not get into the state where we think that demand for accountability is something we can only do through the ballot, right? We must keep being engaged. So this thing of look at that finance bill and see what it says and tell it to your grandmother as well, right? Look at the agricultural bills they're bringing to the floor of the house, right?
Yeah.
So we must keep pushing back.
Yeah.
I must say this one thing before I finish.
Sure.
We have to look at the way policy making happens in Kenya. Interests are taken care of. Now, the groups that are able to lobby, the groups that are well organized and well focused, are able to lobby for particular things to be included in bills or to be removed. So if you think about, maybe private sector associations like, KEPSA, or LSK and so on and so forth, they have the ability to engage. They don't win always, but sometimes they win.
Right.
The problem for us as citizens is that we don't have many of these mechanisms of aggregating our interests. But if we get ourselves involved in this kind of movements, then we'll be able to keep demanding for a different kind of government. And I think it's possible.
Right. Yeah. What are your thoughts about leaders who pursue a handshake in the midst of unrest? Like recently we just saw whatever Ryder did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Are they out for their own personal interests? And even those people who champion, who are perceived to be champions of people, during an unrest. Because at the end of it all, Kenyans say, who you are kapata offer, he's going to get into the system, right? I mean, so whenever people start saying, Raila is over here just for his own personal interest, and then the president himself, he's saying, you know what? No, I need to talk to my big brother. The broad-based government is the way to go. Yeah. But looking at the past, when it comes to handshakes, amidst unrest, are these people who are there for their own interests and for their parties? There's actually public interest.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it gets very complicated because people have different orientations. So you see, like the handshake, by another name, but a handshake nonetheless. This building, what are they calling it?
Broad-based government.
Yeah. Broad-based government. Kibaki had a government of national unity. Uhuru had a handshake.
He almost had the building bridges.
And the building bridges initiative and all that.
Yeah.
We just keep building
I
things. We never complete these structures. So on the one hand, there are people who argue, and perhaps with good reason, that there are people who just want the stability of the nation, and that might be a valid reason, not because of selfless interest and love for the country, but because of personal interest as well. Because if you're part of the elite, the status quo is very important for you. Even if you're out of power for a bit, maintaining status quo and maintaining control of the political operations, right, of the country is
business as usual.
Yes, is very, very important. Yes. And I mean, to be fair, if you think about it, these people have spent their entire lives doing nothing else but just trying to amass political power. Now, to imagine that a group of young people showing up on the streets can upend all this, a lifetime of work and effort can be very, destabilizing. So that's one side of it. I think the other side is, of course, as you say, self-interest. If there's a good deal on the table, I was just remembering a quote from Francis Mbuga's book. I think it's Betraying the City. That like every liquid has a boiling point, right? So every liquid has a boiling point, and so every human has every person has a price, right? There's a number, right? So then you will see in those kind of situations, you'll be like, let us do a bit of a deal and a horse trading. As you've seen, what has happened is that we've gone back to status quo quite rapidly, because, as I said, the politics largely remains the same. We may be pushing back on governance. We have to really try and enter into that political space as well.
I agree. But the status quo, I mean, that we find ourselves in, clearly, I don't think they have an agenda. And like you say, maybe the agenda is business as usual. But at the same time, I feel like it has to be dislodged. Young guys want alternative leadership that can actually benefit them, that can liberate us economically. Now, the question is, the Gen Z movement, are they the answer to public interest? Are they the answer to alternative leadership? Should we count on them to actually just disrupt everything so we can go back to the drawing board?
Okay, so we are seeing a generation that is willing to challenge the status quo. Which is a bit, we haven't seen much of this before. So I think it's a good thing to watch. Now, unfortunately, I thought this of my generation, our millennials, right? There was, having seen what was happening in the 1990s as we were growing up, having seen the Kibaki presidency, which, had a lot of problems, but we at least saw, some bit of economic transformation.
Right.
And then you look at some of the people we are complaining about right now are people in our generation.
It's true.
The ones who got in.
The young Turks.
The young Turks. In fact, the young Turks were Akina Orengo in the 1990s and Akina Kiraitu, who were fighting against Moi. They were the ones who came into the Kibaki government. If you try and remember some of the biggest scandals,
correct,
there were, some of those similar names were being mentioned in those scandals. Now you look at our generation, the millennials, who came up during this Kibaki period, going into Uhuru Kenyatta's regime, and you start to see the people who are being mentioned in scandals,
biggest letdowns,
and so on and so forth. So I think on the one hand, there's hope in looking at this movement of the Gen Z. But on the other hand, is thinking, we must ask the question, what is it that this system does to people, the ones who get inside, that this then becomes the outcome?
Exactly.
Because there has to be something about that system. And I think, for me, if we are not changing, the mechanisms of getting inside, how much it's costing you, either you are paying for it, or you have a godfather who picks you out and says, ni kijana yangu, ndiye tunapatia hii kiti, right? So then you owe your allegiance to this person more than to the citizens, right? So the system is where where the conversation needs to be at, because even amongst the Gen Zs, there will be selfish and greedy people.
You know what they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Have you got a question, Ten?
First of all, greetings from my good friend Wasiti, saying she's listening to the show.
Oh, great. Hey, hi, Wasiti.
So, you've mentioned about the whole handshake, the broad-based government, and I tend to think, moving forward, are we seeing a Kenyan lot that will get to a point when they say, you know, we've had enough of this and we don't want to see this again? Or are we going just to be political, say for the lack of a better word, slaves to the same games over and over again?
Yeah, so I think the problem we have, and this is a point I remember Professor Wangari Maathai making on a radio interview she was on a while back. I became politically conscious quite a long time ago.
That's good.
She was talking about how Kenya is really, we haven't really become a nation.
Yeah.
We are a grouping of micronations. Right?
Interesting.
And so when you look at the way our politics plays out and why ethnicity tends to always become very important, is because we see the distribution of resources through that ethnic lens. Mtu wangu akikuwa pale, we will get something. We get a waziri, we get a road, we get, you know, and so on. Now, I know that in my region, in central Kenya, there have been few elections, and I predict that the next one is going to be like this, where almost everyone, except a few politicians, make it back to parliament. Right? It happens at regional level. You see where there's a clean sweep of almost all the politicians. But that happens in one region and not in the others.
Okay.
Right? Now, by the time you get to the next election, this one is behaving as the others did the last time, and then you might find a change in another region or in another area. That's why sometimes you might think that there's going to be a massive disruption, but at the end of the day, when the election comes out, that's why some of the older politicians can have the arrogance of saying, "What are you telling me? Do you understand how this system works?" Because for us, a lot of people come into it with theories and very good ideas, but we don't really understand the dynamics of, you know, those clans versus, you know, sub-tribes versus tribes and so on and so forth. So I am hopeful that, and for me, the biggest hope is that the early protests, we saw them happening everywhere around the country, peaceful and, you know, very well organized without causing chaos or riots. So the fact that there's a consciousness amongst the younger generation means that in that generation, there may be a lot more of them who are willing to look beyond the, you know, simple structures and these influences of our clan, tunaenda kupiga kura namna hiyo and so on. So there may be hope, but I can't say that it's going to be in the next election. Hopefully it is.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
But you know, there's hope for the future.
Someday.
But we are not there yet.
But let me ask you, it's interesting you mentioning the young guys, you know, they kind of give us hope for the future. Maybe a lot more of them are going to be very conscious to this era that we're living in. We definitely need to progress. But at the same time, I'm thinking as we wrap up, a candidate that's backed by younger Kenyans versus a Raila and Ruto alliance candidate, obviously Ruto himself, in 2027, who's going to carry the day? A Gen Z backed candidate versus an alliance.
Versus or Morara, better yet.
Morara versus Ruto.
Why are you trying to put me in trouble now?
I mean, you know one thing I like about this show? You can always speculate.
It's very much allowed.
Things that Kenyans talk about. Put it out there.
So if things remain the same, I don't see how you get Ruto out of office. If he's got the backing of Raila, and you see Raila comes with, as you see the way the cabinet slots were distributed, right? So you have Nyanza, you have Western, and you've got Coast, which are the bedrocks of Raila's support. Then you look at President Ruto. He already has his support base. Perhaps the Central Kenya, Mount Kenya region is not guaranteed. So the person who comes in who can challenge this must be able to do two things. You must be able to consolidate a tribal or ethnic bloc.
Yep.
and then build on top of that the Gen Z and the younger population, right? If someone can strike that balance, then potentially. But otherwise, I don't see it.
Yeah, me too.
I don't see it. What I think might happen, though, assuming that it's an election that is free and fair, I think it could be the first time we're going to a runoff proper.
All right.
Because I think there's a possibility of the votes being split in a bit of an unusual way, depending on who the candidates are. Which might deny anyone a quick victory on the first round. Now that would be interesting. Because if two of the candidates were then to gang up against the president, then maybe. But these are all hypotheticals.
Correct.
Again, we're a bit too far away from the election to see who the candidates are, what the dynamics will be like. It's not a guarantee, also, that Raila will support President Ruto in the election. So we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, all right. So, 10, have you got any?
No. Amazing conversation.
That was a fire conversation, my brother. Thanks so much for coming through.
My pleasure.
Yeah, man. So remember, guys, we've been hanging out with Dr. Kamau Wairuri. He's a political analyst, and it's all about the anti-public interest culture in the 254. Good stuff, man. All right. So 10, when we come back,
a fire mix.
Yes. That's in the next hour. But also we're going to cruise the internet.
We'll be cruising the internet more. I have interesting stories when it comes to cruising the internet. I'll tell you 10 reasons. You get to know that you don't live in Nairobi City.
What? Naweza kwa Nairobi, but I'm really not in Nairobi.
Nitakwambia 10 reasons as to why you're not in Nairobi.
So, we'll get into that. Good evening, guys.
One hit at a time. The best music on the best radio. Spice FM.
Yeah.